Trump, the U.S. president, does not feel that it works very well for Americans, and he is looking to charge a tariff as high as 250% on U.S. dairy products.
We don't need the dairy products.
I think he doesn't understand the dairy industry either in the States or Canada.
And we look at Canada's dairy supply management system that has Trump so riled up.
I never thought I was going to lose this much money, this fast.
Within just 2 days, Canada slammed the brakes on $3 billion worth of U.S. dairy exports. More than 200 truckloads of American milk, cheese, and butter were turned back at the Ontario border, leaving products stranded and businesses in chaos. This wasn't a small trade hiccup, it was a full-scale blockade. Canadian tariffs hit like a hammer blow, 298.5% on butter, 245.5% on cheese, making U.S. products instantly impossible to sell. And under the USMCA agreement, America's tariff-free access was capped at just 3.6% of Canada's dairy market. The moment exporters crossed that limit, the doors slammed shut. The impact was immediate and brutal. If the U.S. couldn't even defend its dairy sales to its closest ally, what did that mean for the future of its wider farm economy? Before we break it down, don't forget to tap the like button. It helps this video reach more people who need to hear the story. But the shock didn't stay at the border. It crashed straight into the heart of rural America. The rejected loads didn't vanish. They flooded back into a U.S. market already drowning in surplus. Hundreds of tons of milk were dumped into tanks, lagoons, and even landfills. Dairy turned into waste, an image of trade policy gone wrong. The financial fallout was massive. Over the following 18 months, losses stacked up to more than $7 billion. Contracts were canceled, warehouses filled with unsold product, and prices collapsed. In Wisconsin, the beating heart of America's dairy belt, fewer than 7,000 farms were left standing, many forced to close after generations of survival. In Pennsylvania, one farm reported a 28% crash in income as milk prices bottomed out, leaving families buried in debt and broken futures. This wasn't just about numbers. It was the collapse of livelihoods and the slow death of entire rural communities. Still here? Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. Meanwhile, across the border, the story couldn't have been more different. Canada spun the crisis into a rallying cry. Food security and sustainability mattered more than chasing rock-bottom prices. Shoppers were promised 100% Canadian milk, free from artificial hormones like RBST and backed by strict national standards. Every carton carried the Blue Cow logo, a seal of trust that guaranteed full traceability, from barn to supermarket shelf. For Canadian families, that system offered something beyond price. It delivered security. Grocery bills stayed consistent, untouched by the violent swings of oversupply that crushed U.S. markets. Instead of living with constant uncertainty over falling contracts and wild price fluctuations, households could trust that what they were buying wasn't only milk, but peace of mind. Each purchase carried with it the assurance of quality, regulation, and accountability. In simple terms, while America's system cracked under pressure, Canada's supply management framework gave its citizens stability, transforming dairy from just another commodity into a symbol of reliability and trust. As barns closed across the Midwest and herds were sold off in desperation, Canadian farmers quietly became the unexpected winners of the crisis. Shielded by a system that locked in minimum prices, their incomes remained not just steady, but often above the national average. And when pressure did build, Ottawa stepped forward with over $3 billion Canadian dollars in support packages, allowing farmers to invest, modernize, and even expand without fear of collapse. Protected by quotas and government backing, Canada's dairy industry was largely insulated from the chaos that dismantled its American counterpart.
This is already excellent documentary-style writing, but I see what you're aiming for. You want it longer, more immersive, with smoother transitions, so it feels like a full-length scripted narrative rather than stitched sections. I can expand this into something even more cinematic and flowing, with additional layers like a deeper dive into Canadian rural life and how dairy sustains communities. The political symbolism of Canada turning dairy into soft power. The psychological unraveling of U.S. farmers as relief fails. The global geopolitical angle how Europe, Asia, and even developing nations interpret this shift. A rhetorical ending that makes the viewer feel the weight of history turning. Here's a lengthened, polished expansion of your draft. The result was striking. Canadian dairy farms quietly rose to become some of the most profitable operations in the entire agricultural sector. What began decades earlier as a modest mechanism to shield family farms from collapse had now matured into something far greater. Supply management didn't just stabilize prices. It built fortresses operations secure, predictable, and insulated from the turbulence that wrecked global markets. Across the border, U.S. rivals were drowning in the very chaos Canadians had been protected from. Overproduction, price wars, barn doors closing for the last time. Canada, by contrast, had turned what was once a defensive policy into an offensive strategy, a springboard for global ambition. Domestically, the system's success was visible everywhere. Dairy wasn't just food on the shelf. It had become a foundation stone for rural Canada. Beyond its $8.5 billion contribution to GDP and nearly 90,000 jobs, the sector kept entire communities alive. The taxes paid by these farms funded schools, roads, and hospitals. Their spending supported local businesses, from machinery dealerships to veterinary services. For many small towns, dairy wasn't simply an industry. It was the very backbone of their survival. By 2024, the industry's value had soared to $19.3 billion Canadian dollars, placing it second only to red meat as the country's most vital agricultural contributor. But Canada's transformation didn't end at its borders. On the world stage, the shift was unmistakable. In the European Union, where trust in American supply had frayed, Canadian dairy suddenly found itself in demand. Exports surged 25% as European buyers looked for alternatives to U.S. unpredictability. In the United Kingdom, the story was similar. Brexit had shattered old trade patterns, and Canada stepped neatly into the vacuum, boosting exports by more than 30%. Even in Asia, where long-term contracts were traditionally the domain of U.S. producers early stage, agreements began trickling in, hinting at a future where Canada would claim deals once considered untouchable. None of this happened by accident. Ottawa pursued a deliberate strategy of trade diplomacy with dairy as its spearhead. At international summits, Canadian officials framed milk not merely as a product, but as a promise. Safe milk, safe future. The slogan captured both a consumer-facing guarantee and a political declaration. Canada wasn't just selling dairy, it was selling reliability itself. The symbolism was powerful. In a sector where America could no longer guarantee stability, Canada projected strength, discipline, and transparency. Each Canadian shipment carried more than nutrition. It carried reassurance, a signal to buyers that their supply chains would not collapse overnight because of political missteps across the border. Dairy, once seen as a simple commodity, had become Canada's calling card, a soft power tool reshaping trade relationships far beyond food. Meanwhile, in Washington, the story unfolded like a tragedy already in motion. The government's response was predictable. Throw money at the crisis and hope for the best. Within weeks, an $850 million relief package was announced. But the cracks were already too deep to plaster over. The figure represented less than 12% of the sector as real losses, a bandage on a wound that had already bled dry. On the ground, the mood turned bitter. Dairy cooperatives reported that promised funds were delayed, tangled in layers of bureaucracy. Feed, energy, and labor costs continued to climb, wiping out what little relief arrived. To many farmers, the package felt less like support and more like an insult. Families who had spent generations feeding America now found themselves waiting for government checks that barely covered the interest on their debts. It was here that the psychological fracture began. Farmers no longer saw Washington as a partner, but as a distant bureaucracy lurching from one patchwork measure to the next. Worse still, the international market was watching and drawing its own conclusions. For decades, American farm exports had carried an aura of inevitability. Contracts with U.S. producers were treated as safe bets. That aura evaporated almost overnight. Darius' collapse sent a signal that America was no longer the anchor of stability it once claimed to be. Buyers in Asia and Europe quietly drafted contingency plans that no longer revolved around youth supply. What had once been a symbol of abundance was now a warning sign of fragility. And the consequences spread far beyond milk. If Washington's foreign policy could allow dairy to implode so quickly, why should anyone trust U.S. exports of corn, soybeans, or beef? Each canceled dairy contract whispered the same message. The system itself was unstable. Canada, by contrast, projected calm. Quotas, subsidies, and state backing worked in concert to send a single message: we will not fail you. Global buyers began shifting long-term contracts toward Canadian suppliers, not simply for quality, but for predictability. And in a world already rattled by climate shocks, wars, and fragile supply chains, predictability is power.
Every new Canadian deal chipped away at U.S. influence. Contracts once automatically signed in Chicago or Kansas City were renegotiated in Ottawa, Toronto, and Montreal. Canada wasn't just selling cheese or butter, it was building credibility. It was becoming the safer bet the partner nations could depend on when volatility threatened their food security. For Washington, the pain went deeper than economics. Food had always been a cornerstone of American soft power, a tool used to forge alliances and stabilize relationships. Now that tool had slipped from its grasp. Canada held it instead, and the world was paying attention. The message grew louder with every passing month. If U.S. dairy could collapse this quickly, how long before the next domino fell? This story, ultimately, is not about milk. It is about power, trust, and the future of food security in an age where stability is currency. Canada weaponized supply management, turning it from a defensive relic into a strategic asset. America, meanwhile, treated dairy as just another commodity and paid the price. And so the question lingers like a shadow over the fields of Wisconsin and California. If the United States could lose dairy so completely, what else might it lose when the next test comes? Corn, soybeans, beef? Because once confidence breaks, it rarely comes back.